Okay, welcome everybody. We will begin by an acknowledgement of country.
Hi everyone. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. For me in Melbourne, this is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and so I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging.
Okay, thank you, Simon. So I'd like to welcome everybody here on behalf of the maths team. Just to give you an overview of what we're going to be doing today, we've had a number of undergraduate students that have taken part in summer or other time projects throughout this year. A lot of those have been funded by the faculty of CB. That includes, we have Lena and Alex, who have been funded by a mini ARC MAP grant. We've got Emma, who was part of the CSRI summer school project, and Bob, who was funded by both an AMSI via AMSI, let me get this, Vocation Research Scholarship, and a CB Summer Program scholarship. So today we're going to have 4 talks, starting with Emma, and after all those talks, we'll give everybody an opportunity to ask questions or to discuss. So I'd like to welcome Emma Lee Srdarev, who's going to talk about community detection as our first talk.
Give me just a moment. I'm working with one hand today, so everything just takes a little bit longer. Give me just a sec. Okay. Okay, can everybody see my screen, hopefully?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Oh. Okay, so sorry, I broke my wrist, and so I'm navigating the mouse with my left hand. Just takes a little bit longer. Okay, so good afternoon. Thanks for having me here today. My name's Emily, and I'm going to present a summary of the research program that, yes, as you mentioned, Gary, I completed with the Centre for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation, and under the supervision of Dr. Jessie Lackley, who's also here. So the title is Fast Community Detection with Graph Sparsification applied to a cybersecurity data set. A bit of a mouthful, couldn't quite think of anything catchier, I'm afraid. Okay, so I'm going to start with this phrase here, data is the new oil. So it was said in 2006 by the
Гриша, ты свой кофе выпьешь когда-нибудь или нет?
That's not from my end.
I fixed that problem. Continue. Sorry about that, Emma.
No problem. So data is the new oil. Clive Humby said it in 2006. He's a mathematician and data scientist. And whether or not you agree with this sweeping statement, it's apparent that data is hugely important, and we generate an enormous amount of it every day, and it's used for a huge range of applications. So we've got pattern recognition, bioinformatics, data compression, machine learning, the list goes on. So in the field of cybersecurity, which is what I study, it's used by intrusion detection systems to automatically detect breach attempts. So for all of the uses that I mentioned, it's necessary that we find patterns and anomalies in the data.
Excuse me, Emma, are you sharing your screen with everybody? Some people are saying they can't see the screen. Sorry to interrupt.
I can see the screen.
I can see it. Maybe just try resharing.
Okay.
It's fine over here.
Okay.
And then if it's still a problem, then maybe
I
people
will
just need to go
share-
out and come in again.
I will share a copy of the slides in the chat for people. So is that okay with you, Emma? So if somebody can't see it, they can look at the slides in the chat?
Yeah, sure, definitely.
Okay, excuse me about that.
Okay, so yeah, so for all of the uses that I mentioned, it's necessary that we find patterns in data quickly and as efficiently as possible, so to minimize error. And because we now collect so much data, it's really important that we make it more and more efficient, just in order to keep up with everything that we're collecting. Classic methods, are just not really keeping up. So we need to find ways to make data analysis more efficient, and that's where this project comes in. So spectral clustering, it's a robust data analysis technique that finds communities of similar data points using graph theory and Laplacian matrices. So last year, as I mentioned, the paper Fast Community Detection with Graph Sparsification was published by Jessie. And it investigates the use of error analysis to improve spectral clustering for stochastic block models, or SBMs. So we wanted to know, could we apply this model to cybersecurity data sets commonly found in the literature? So for the long version is, for our project, is it possible to introduce error into the spectral clustering of a cybersecurity data set to make its analysis more efficient while still successfully recovering communities? So in this presentation, I'll basic outline of the spectral clustering and graph partitioning algorithms. I'll briefly summarize Jessie's paper and its implications. I will mention our data set selection process, and then I will go through the clustering that we carried out, both with and without error, and then finally I'll explain the results. So we're going to start with a little explanation of graph partitioning. So since spectral clustering functions as an extension of this. So we've got this graph here, and the edges between the nodes are weighted and actually denote the similarity between the nodes. So if we want to separate the graph into two groups, which I'll bring up the next picture here. So the two groups on the left, G1, on the right, G2, of similar points, how are we going to do this? So if we have numerical representations of the similarities, so for instance, in group G1, we've got 0.8, 0.6, 0.8 as the edges, and these represent the similarity. So the higher the number, the more similar they are. And in between the two groups, in between G1 and G2, we've got lower weighted edges, so 0.1 and 0.2 respectively. So with graph partitioning, what the aim is to essentially remove those edges with the lower weights rather, or to cut the graph even. And sometimes we do this with consideration of volume or number of vertices, just to make it more accurate. So yes, spectral clustering, which can create these pretty graphs like on the right here. It uses Laplacian matrices and eigenpairs, which are eigenvalues and their associated eigenvectors. So it separates communities of similar points by exploiting special properties of the Laplacian matrices. And it's really highly robust, especially for big data, and it's more accurate than other forms like k-means when faced with irregularly shaped clusters. However, because we are calculating eigenvectors, this can get computationally expensive for our large data sets. And just to give a little refresher on eigenvectors and eigenvalues, they're defined by this equation up here, AX equals a lambda x. Okay, so the steps of spectral clustering. First of all, we create a similarity graph. So we calculate the similarities and put them into matrix form, and then we reduce the dimensions. So yeah, essentially we're mapping the graph to a lower dimension space using the eigenvectors and eigenvalues of the Laplacian form of the matrix. And then finally, we partition the transformed data into clusters. Okay, so Jessie's paper looks at spectral clustering within specific parameters. So for SBMs specifically, and I should say an SBM is a particular type of random graph model, and it's theoretical, and it looks at two communities only. And what the paper does is it evaluates what happens when variable amounts of error are introduced in either of two ways. So one, by randomly dropping edges, and this has the effect of sparsifying the graph, or two, by approximating the eigenpairs. So both of these processes mean that it's more efficient to process the data, to analyze the data. But yes, we wanted to know how much error could it tolerate before the algorithm is no longer able to detect unities. And the paper found a very interesting result that an SBM can tolerate a significant amount of the error that results from eigenvector approximation. So yeah, the project last summer looked at whether we could apply this to a non-theoretical cybersecurity data set. So the process started with finding the data set and taking a subset. Then we processed the data, and then we performed spectral clustering both with and without error, and then we compared the results. So in terms of data set selection, it took a little while to find something appropriate, but we finally decided to use the 2010 ISOT botnet dataset, which is a combination of publicly available malicious and non-malicious traffic, and collected over a 3-month period. So we took a subset of 10,500 packets, about 60% of which was malicious. We got the data in as in PCAP form, and we extracted data from it using Python's Gabby library. And in terms of the graph representation, I've got a diagram with just some random weights up here, but just to indicate that the nodes themselves were representative of packets, and then the edges in between them was a numerical indication of their similarity. So yeah, once again, here's an example similarity matrix. So for instance, the similarity between node P1 and P1 is 1, which means that they are obviously identical. Between P2 and P1 is 0.1, etc. And sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to create a similarity graph. So how we did it, well, we use Python, and we use characteristics such as layer name, layer type, MAC addresses, version length, checksum, etc. And when the value wasn't a number already, we hashed it to put it into numerical form. So in the end, we ended up with each packet having a corresponding array of numbers. And to calculate the similarity of two packets or two nodes, what we did is we took the dot product of their arrays. So then we essentially had this giant matrix, and it held all of these numbers which represented the similarity of the 10,000 nodes. And this similarity matrix was the input to our spectral clustering algorithm. So, I should say, now we moved to MATLAB because it's a lot more efficient, and working with Laplacian matrices has a lot of great inbuilt functions as well. So we imported the data into MATLAB, and then we did some clustering without error. So yeah, we took the data, we took the normalized Laplacian and the unnormalized Laplacian of the similarity matrix. We calculated all the eigenvalues and the corresponding eigenvectors, and we also took note of the Fiedler value, which is the second smallest eigenvalue, and it has some really important properties for spectral clustering. Yes, and I should say notably, the number of 0 eigenvalues of the similarity matrix is equivalent to the number of the connected components in the graph, which is what allows us to partition the data. And so we essentially, this is the process. So pre-process the graph, calculate the Laplacians, solve for the eigenpairs, and then we're able to cluster and partition the data. So the algorithm detected at least 3 communities. Just bringing it up now, this is plotted with MATLAB. It's a little bit fuzzy, I apologize, but hopefully you get the gist. So on the left-hand side, we have a plot of the data points, and this is with no error. So the tolerance is 1e to -14, and normalizes the top row and unnormalizes the bottom row. And on the right-hand column, we've got the plotted eigenvectors. So yeah, essentially if only I could point to it here, the top left and the bottom right, you'll see that there are solid yellow groups, and these are the communities that it's detected. And then it's
sorry to interrupt him. I don't think we can see actually.
Oh,
unless...
okay. I'll let's go out and try to show just that slide.
We're stuck on the slide clustering without error. So
Okay.
with the 4 blue boxes, we don't see any of the.
Is it working now?
I still only see slide 14.
Very strange.
Do you want me to share your slides from here?
Yeah, that might be a better idea. There aren't too many left. Luckily, there's only 5 or 6 left, but that would be great if you could.
Okay, let me try that.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
My things are... Okay, so it should be this slide, is that right?
Yeah, beautiful, thanks. Okay, so yeah, the plotted matrices in the left-hand side, the plotted eigenvectors on the right-hand side. Essentially what it means is the algorithm was able to detect communities rather than 2. It detected at least 3, and this makes sense because the data set is an amalgamation of several sets, as I mentioned earlier, in various traffic types. So in the left-hand column in those plots, you'll see the communities represented by blocks of yellow color. And if we could have the next slide, please. Okay, so this here is a graph which shows the normalized and unnormalized Laplacians and the accuracy with which we were able to recover communities, essentially. So we, on the tolerance mentioned, is a reflection of the amount of error that was introduced, essentially. So for the normalized Laplacian, on the top there, you can see that we were able to fairly successfully recover both clusters for all error values. And this is because it was, well, this is likely because it was a fairly, 60% malicious traffic, essentially. So this result would vary, according to different factors, but because it is so highly accurate, it's a really promising result. And next slide, please. Okay, this is another graphical representation of clustering with eigenvalue error. So this is, we've got the tolerance of 0.1. So this is quite a bit of error incorporated, and you can see that we're still able to recover both clusters. And next slide, please. And next is when we introduced error through matrix sparsification, which means just randomly dropping edges. So we randomly dropped different proportions just to see what would happen. So we dropped 80, 90, 95 and 99% of edges. And you can see what it does to the graph. So yeah, it was faster, but it really wasn't accurate in the end. But if we were able to combine the two, then that could be also useful. Okay, and next slide, please. So we've got the results here side by side. So it's easier to see that when we use sparsification, the blocks of yellow, which indicate the community recovering, I guess you could say, it doesn't line up when the graph is sparsified. But however, when we introduce error by approximating eigenvectors, which is on the right hand side, as opposed to no error at all, which is a diagram on the very left, and we still were able to successfully recover the communities. And yes, I feel we're on to the last slide now, so thanks very much for listening. It was a bit of a mouthful there, and I've got my email there if you have any questions.
Okay, thank you, Emily. We'll leave our questions till after all the talks. So if you want to just note them down, but that was a very interesting talk, of course, being about graph theory. And I should have mentioned, as Emily mentioned, that Jessie was the supervisor of Emily in the CSIRO project. The second speaker we have today is Duc Minh, and he's going to talk about rational approximations, and his supervisors were Julian and Renier. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you for the introduction. Very glad to have you. Do you see my slides? So double check first. Can everyone see my slide? Oh, good. Yeah. Cool. So I'm going to start now. Sure. So there's a type of one I'm going to go through with the introduction and go through a bit my work. Due to the time limitation of 10 minutes, I'm just going to go rapidly about the whole idea of our method and a bit of the result for a simple result. Yeah. So introduction. So basically what we work on is approximation theory. So the idea of approximation theory is when we actually have a goal function and we try to approximate it using a much simpler function, which normally is polynomial function. So the idea is very fascinating because if you think about the whole world, you can see everything is almost like a function with an input and an output, but it's a very complicated function that we're living in now. So what if we actually can approximate it using a very simple function that we can use it for prediction, something like that. So the way we did it, we actually use rational approximation. We actually use rational function instead of just simple polynomial function, because when we actually did research on it, we find rational function can better doing approximation. It actually have some sharper approximations. For example, if you see some graph that like very fluctuate, rational function actually can try to approximate so sharp and fluctuate standard chain like that. So here, this is so what the math thing I'm just putting on here is like the math of actual polynomial function for PT, QT. So instead of the approach of trying to minimize FT minus GT, here's FT minus PT over QT. And the goal, which I actually try to find A and B here, which is called the coefficient. Yep. So here I find the alpha and beta here. So the way we did it, we actually use alternative projection. So so to actually explain it a bit easier. So instead actually having a whole range from A to B, which is the range we try to approximate, while I was having just one point. So that's one point we call the point X. A perfect approximation will have equal Fx minus Px over Qx equals 0. And after we actually convert it into the final transformation of theta I xi plus 0, this is actually a linear formula. So basically, is it calculatable? We actually can calculate it. So if we have just one point, we actually can find the coefficient A and B in the space of Rn plus n plus 2. So we actually can find that in that hyperplane using the hyperplane formula. So that's one point. How about I have multiple points? So for example, if I try to approximate from A to B, so we actually can have multiple hyperplane on that. So the number of hyperplane is infinite, of course. So, but the problem is, for example, from A to B, I only break it into 6 hyperplane. So actually, by having also hyperplane, and each of them is actually a perfect approximation, exact 1 point only. So the intersection of all those hyperplane, because they all live in the same place, all in the same space, all n plus n plus 2. So the intersection of it should be our solution. So that is the whole basic idea of our method. So in our method, we have n, m. So n and m actually is the so the level, the power of the polynomial. And we actually have h is actually try to define the number of hyperplane. Like for example, from range A to B, we actually have infinite. So to make it feasible and actually applicable on our method, we actually have to define the number of hyperplane 1, 2, and the error of breadth. Okay, so here I actually need to explain a bit more. So there are 2 scenarios that possibly can happen. So one is when everything is perfect, and we actually can have the intersection. So we actually have a solution. So that's, you can see, it's on the left-hand side. So if we actually starting at some very random point and we actually project it on one hyperplane, and then we project it on the next hyperplane and keep doing that over and over again, it actually will convert. So if we have a solution, it will convert into 1 point, and that's the meaning of the error rate, because like it will keep convert. So if the smaller error rate, that means we're actually closer to that solution using that keep projecting like that. So, but that's the best scenario, which rarely happen because like it only happen when the function itself, the goal function itself, is actually a rational function made up of a polynomial. So normal scenario is actually on the right-hand side when you see actually there's no solution. And if we keep projecting each of the hyperplanes, they will be converged to 1 point on each of those hyperplanes. It actually is the scenario we're interested to see. Okay, so here actually I talk about a bit of our research finding. So to actually see where actually our method works, we actually test it on an actual rational functions make a polynomial. So this should create a very good result. And the result is actually correct. So I will actually skip the table. We actually can come back if we actually have question on that. This is the result. I'm using different n and m and different steps. So the step actually is the number of hyperplane and also different error rate. So here's some example in different n and m. So for n of 2, 2 or 3, 3, 4, 4. So of course there should be higher number n and m for the actually polynomial power. There should be have better results, which you can actually see here. And because this itself, the goal function itself actually a rational function made of polynomial, so the results should be very fit and actually really good like this. So the reason we do is to try to see what is the key, what is the factor that we want that actually makes the most impact. So the first one is n, and this one actually just sees the actual different results. So that is the ft minus gx, fx minus gx here. You actually see here. So the here actually closer and closer to 0 at the later step, and actually the difference very small in way. This one actually is the error rate, and actually in here in our case here, the error rate actually shows the best result when actually a very small error rate actually makes the approximate function much closer to the goal function. You can actually see it clear. So this is a little bit fluctuate, but you actually see closer on the label here. You actually see is actually the difference is very, very small, extremely small, especially as the later state, and almost actually closer to 0. So that's what we find. So they actually work well. So that's actually at least proves that our method actually works. But now when you actually try with some even more complex functions that actually fluctuate like this, so this is something we actually expect to see. The result actually become much more, well, is actually have very difficult to actually, well, it's not that good. They actually need a lot more work. So you can actually see here. So the absolute function is the blue one actually is only try as a later step with even with better error rate, like we actually identify rate maybe actually very important key. Actually, it's like just go with the middle. It's can't really just fluctuate as we expected to do. And of course, that's good bad result for the f8 minus gx as well. When actually we see how about the number of hyperplane? Can actually changing the number of hyperplane, number of hyperplane should create better result or not? But it's still not, well, it did a bit better, but still not actually fix the issue as we expected to do. And the same result actually happened. So after everything like this, we realize there's a lot of limitation on this method, even though it's really good. I mean, it's good in terms of easy implementation, the idea actually well, but there are limitation because in the end, is from the whole range to A to B, they actually infinite. And here we actually using finite plane, and we only can do it on a very limited range. And they actually sometimes we have extreme point, like computer stability and the difference between higher plane. So this is an example of the extreme point. When you suddenly have one point that go extreme to other place, and well, I don't know where that come from. So one way we actually can interpret it and actually explain it is actually from the, so let's say in the normal scenario, we actually don't really have a solution for trying to find the intersect of also hyperplane, and we only have that one conversion point on each of the hyperplane, and we actually make we actually connect all the point, and we try to find one point. Actually, we calculate one point from that for a solution from all the list of points like that. So the way we did it was very simple. We just try to find the average point, which maybe not be the best, because from maybe in the case like this, the average point is actually near to close to x1 and close to x2, but actually very far away from the x3 on the hyperplane number 3. So this actually can make the results not accurately expected. So there's a lot more future work that we need to work on. For example, we actually can make more specific algorithm, because again, actually it is only on a range, and actually it's kind of the whole project actually a piecewise approximation. We actually try to find a different range. We actually can use different method to actually approximate it, because sometimes the more sophisticated algorithm can actually not very time consuming, while this method actually time saving, which is nice. And then we actually try to find, can we actually work with infinite hyperplane? And the last one, let's say, which is the issue as I mentioned, how to create the final point from the list of convergent points. And yeah, that is my presentation. Thank you guys for listening. Cheers.
Okay, thank you, Bob. That was really, really good. Our next speaker is going to be Alex Hocking, who has been working under a MAP grant, mini ARC grant, with Julian and myself. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Kerry. I'll just get my slides up now. Can you all see my slides? All right, so yeah, hi everyone.
Sorry, Alex, I just suddenly thought I forgot to mention he's also been working with Sergey. Sorry, Sergey. Sergey.
That's all right, no worries.
My nervous in the chair, that's all. Sorry about that. Bye.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex, and I'll be talking about my involvement in a project to calculate the potential throughput or bandwidth between regions of the human brain. So yeah, firstly, I've been working with paper, working with Nick, Julian, Kerry, Sergey, Sue, Govinda, Juan, Karen, and myself. And as Kerry mentioned, I've been supervised by Julian herself and Sergey. And as she mentioned, yeah, I had some funding from Kerry and a map discovery grant for my involvement in the project. So at the moment, there's a lot of research happening at focusing on how messages navigate within the brain. And many applications have been using maths and graph theory, but with a lot of focus on the direct connections between different regions rather than regions that are indirectly connected. So with much less being done on these indirect regions, we were hoping to start looking at the different sequences of steps between regions and how much information can go between them. So one important property of the brain that's been identified is that it's a small world. So there are many short connections, but not many long connections. So if we look at the images on the right, comparing the random network and the small world network, most nodes in the small world network are connected to their nearest neighbors, and the distant neighbors can be efficiently reached with only a small number of hops, even with very few edges between distant regions. So both of these networks have the same number of regions and edges between the different brain regions. However, the random network, not all regions can be reached in just a few steps. In the small world network, however, though, even though most regions that they're close to their neighbours, they aren't directly connected with distant regions. So in our project, we aim to measure the variation in shortest path lengths of many healthy brains to see how often the indirect paths occur, and then create a new measure to work out the volume of information that could be transferred over these indirect paths. So firstly, the two main forms of data we've worked with were structural connectivity and functional connectivity of the brain. So structural connectivity represents the physical pathways, and that's measured by counting the number of white matter tracks between the different brain regions. And so these are the different nodes in the graph on the left here are the different regions, and the edges in the blue one, which is the structural connectivity graph, the edges are these white matter tracks between the regions. And then in the red graph on the bottom, these are the regions that are considered functionally synchronous, and that is from our functional connectivity, which measures the different fluctuations in brain activity in different regions and how much they correlate with each other. And so the gray lines on the graph just show that both of these networks on the left are from the same brain, just a different way of representing them based on different types of data that we're looking at. And so this again demonstrates that both layers map to the same brain. So on the right, the red line means that the functional activity in the regions on either side are highly correlated. And we can see in the blue lines that the regions aren't directly connected, but there is a node above them that indirectly connects the two functionally synchronous regions. So some of the previous work that's been done, which is what a lot of our work builds upon, looks at node clustering in these two different layers of the brain. And the structure function clustering coefficient measures how often a region acts as an intermediate stopover between these functionally connected regions where there isn't a direct path between them. So for example, on the right, if we look at region A, which is a node on the left, there are 3 different possible pairs of those blue structural connections that we can consider. So the first pair contains the top two blue connections leading out of region A. And we can see that, yes, with the region A, we can form a physical path between those two regions where the red line is. And then if we look at the bottom 2 edges, we can see that there is also a connection using A between those, but we ignore this path because there's already a more efficient link, which is directly connected with that blue line that overlaps the red functional connection there. And then at the last 2 regions that A joins, these aren't functionally synchronous. As we can see, there is no red line. So of the 3 paths we considered, 1 was discarded because it already had a shorter direct path. And of the remaining 2 paths, only one of them joined the ends of the red line. So therefore the structure functioning clustering coefficient of the region A is 2. So this measures how often the region A can be used as a single stopover to perform the shortest path between those functionally synchronous regions. So for our work, we instead from focusing on the node, we were looking at the actual edge, the red line, those connection between those 2 different regions. And so we first wanted to validate that looking at indirect paths would be worth looking at. So we calculated the distribution of shortest path between these regions. And after finding evidence that those indirect paths were common, we then developed a new measure to work out the highest capacity or bandwidth of information that could be sent across these shortest paths. So yeah, our first aim was to measure those path lengths, and we looked at direct connections first. So in this example of a brain, there are 2 pairs of functionally synchronous regions. They're the 2 red edges, and however, only one of them has a direct connection. And that's seen in the graph on the right, where there's a blue connection overlapping that red line. We move on to paths of length 2. There are 3 possible paths, but we discard one of them again because of that direct connection. And the 2 that are left here, there becomes 2 different ways to physically navigate across those 2 regions. And so overall, we can see that there is a 50-50 split between a direct connection and a 2-path connection of all the red, those red lines, functionally synchronous regions in this brain. So we continued doing this for 484 different brains, and we looked at all the different shortest path lengths, and we found that very few of them had a direct path, as we can see in the path length of 1 in the x-axis here, and most of them could be navigated with 2 or 3 hops. So the blue points here are the results taken from the 484 different brains, and the grey points represent the expected shortest path lengths when using random graphs with the same density of connections in both structural and functional layers. And the difference between the grey and the blue points suggests that the results are more significant than a random variation. And with such a low proportion attributed to direct paths, it is likely that most messages moving between those regions would require at least an intermediate hop. So it leads on to our second aim, which was then to create a new measure to calculate how much information can be transferred between those regions. So in this diagram, the connections in the structural layer, the blue edges, they now have different thicknesses to represent the different number of connections between those regions from our data, rather than whether or not there is only a connection or not. So it's a weighted graph. And we consider the bandwidth of information that can be passed to be restricted by the thinnest connection or the edge with the fewest connections between regions. So that is, the bandwidth is proportional to the thinnest connection. In the example on the right, there's a direct connection, so the bandwidth is proportional to the width of the blue physical connection between them. For the other pair of functionally synchronous regions, the connection is not direct, so there are 2 different paths between the regions. For both of these paths, the bandwidth is proportional to the thinnest connection, which acts as the bottleneck for the rate that information can be transferred between those 2 nodes. So in the example on the left has the lower bandwidth, since its thinnest connection is thinner than the thinnest connection of the example on the right. So a brief summary of what we found was there was a positive relationship between the bandwidth and the strength of the functional correlations of the different regions. And we also found several high bandwidth paths that travel across different brain hemispheres when there weren't any shortest paths from those regions across those hemispheres. And so, yeah, thank you everyone for listening. So I wasn't able to get permission to talk more about our equations or specific details about our methods and results, but I'm happy to take any more questions at the end of the presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, so yes, I can assure you he's got some very nice things that are in a submitted paper, but unfortunately we have several collaborators and he has to get permission before he can share all of those. Our final talk is by Lena, and Lena was supervised in the MAP project as well, and her supervisors were Sergey, Julian and myself. Thanks, Lena.
Thank you, Carrie. Okay. Can you see my screen and hear me okay? Yep. Perfect. Okay, so I have been part of the MAAP funded project elucidating human brain connectivity through deep learning and network analysis. And today I will specifically speak about how we can use graph theory to predict neuronal communication pathways in the brain. Okay, I just want to give you a very quick introduction into neuroscience in the brain. So the brain is our most complex organ, is not only responsible for controlling our most basic functions such as breathing, but also for our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviors, and essentially everything that makes us how we are. And in order to achieve such complex functions, the brain actually consists of approximately 10 to 100 billion neurons, that is brain cells, which communicate via electrochemical signals along trillions of connections. And while we have a relatively good understanding how the brain communicates on a microstructure level, that is on a neuronal level, it is still uncertain how the brain communicates on a larger scale, that is, how does communication across brain regions takes place. And in particular, what we are interested in is how does the brain structure facilitates communication between brain regions to achieve a functional outcome. And so the discipline of computation and neuroscience is heavily involved with these kind of questions. And one particular stream of research, including our project, focuses on the application of graph theory to the brain in order to extract important information about both the brain's structural and functional properties. And just to give you a quick introduction into graph theory, is the study of graphs that essentially model relationships between objects. And objects within a graph are typically referred to as nodes or vertices, and the connections between objects are referred to as edges. And here on the slide, we just have an example of a social network where every node represents a person and every edge represents a friendship between two people. But with regards to the brain specifically, we can use graph theory to model how different brain regions are structurally or functionally connected. And Alex already covered this in his presentation, so I'll go over this only very briefly. So two brain regions are said to be structurally connected if fiber track pathways, that is bundles of neurons, exist between them. And essentially this means that those two brain regions are physically connected and that they can communicate with each other directly. And we can use different kinds of neuroimaging techniques to determine structure connectivity. One way is by the use of diffusion weighted imaging, which provides us with high contrast images of the brain tissue organization and which allows us to reconstruct those fiber track pathways that I mentioned. And examples of images of the brain that are based on diffusion you can see here at the top right. And then in contrast, two brain regions are said to be functionally connected if they are active at the same time. That is, there is a significant relationship between the measures of activity recorded from them. And in this instance, we can use functional magnetic resonance imaging to detect the level of oxygenated blood in different parts of the brain, which is an indicator of brain activity. And by this, we can obtain images like the ones here on the bottom right, of which brain regions are active at a specified time point. And using all this information, we can now represent the brain as a graph, with every node representing a brain region and every edge representing either a structural connection or a functional connection, depending on what we're interested in. So in this case, we actually have an example of a functional brain network, where every edge indicates that two brain regions are active simultaneously. And so much research has used those brain networks to extract important information about the brain and its properties by using graph theoretical measures. But as I already mentioned earlier, one main goal remains to identify how neuronal signals travel between two functionally connected brain regions that do not have a direct structural connection. And first attempts to answer this question have largely focused on optimal routing strategies and propose that neuronal signals travel via the shortest path between two brain regions. So there is the path that involves the fewest number of hops, or in this case, the path that visits the fewest numbers of brain regions. So for example, in this figure, the shortest path between the start node and the target node is indicated in red, where we can see that longer pathways between those two nodes also exist. So the problem with shortest path measures, however, is that they've been criticized as being too simplistic and unrealistic, because identifying shortest path requires individual nodes to possess centralized or global knowledge of the network topology. So individual nodes need to know about every other node in the network and about their connections. So in this example, for the start node to know what the shortest path is, it needs to know about every single pathway that leads to the target node. But because the brain and its regions in this sense do not possess any kind of knowledge and rather communicate via biological processes, shortest path measures are now thought of being unsuitable for the prediction of communication pathways in the brain. So in response to this criticism, our project actually aims to create a more realistic but also efficient communication strategy that is predominantly based on what we call local knowledge. And just to clarify what we mean by local, so instead of every node having this global knowledge and needing to know about the entire network and its structure, as we see in the picture here on the left, we consider local measures as measures that are restricted to a node's own properties, its adjacent edges properties, and its neighboring nodes properties. And I'm going to give you a few examples in a bit as well. But if we now consider the blue node in the right picture here, this node is only aware of its immediate surroundings, and it makes the decision of where to send the neuronal signal based on only this limited kind of knowledge. And this is what we consider a more local or decentralized communication strategy. And so a large part of this project has been devoted to identifying those local measures of the brain network that may be important for and that may influence neuronal communication, but that are also to some extent biologically explainable. And essentially, the aim of this project is to create a communication algorithm that is based on multiple of those local measures, and which is thereby more realistic than previous attempts, and which can predict neuronal communication pathways with high efficiency. Okay, I just want to give you a few examples of some local measures that we have been working with. So for example, using our structural connectivity graphs of the brain, we are able to look at the properties of individual nodes. And one important and easily obtainable measure is the node's degree. So node degree reflects to how many other nodes a node is connected to. And in this sample graph here on the left, for example, node A is connected to 2 other nodes and so has a degree of 2. And in general, nodes with higher degrees are considered to be more connected and to facilitate information transmission. And similarly, a brain region that has many and strong physical connections, which is reflected by its degree within the brain graph, has a greater ability to transmit signals efficiently and to many different parts of the brain. And therefore, sending neuronal signals towards more connected brain regions is predicted to be preferred by the brain. So if we consider this graph again, if the signal is currently at node A, we predict that sending the signal towards node C, which has a degree of 4, is preferred over sending it to node B, which has only a degree of 3. Okay, so graphs can also be weighted. That is, one can assign a weight to the edges in a graph. And within the brain graph, edge weights correspond to the number of streamlines, which is reflective of the diameter of the fiber tract pathway. And in this instance, more streamlines, so higher edge weights, correspond to faster and more efficient information transmission. And therefore, we predict that sending a neuronal signal along a stronger edge is preferred by the brain. So if you consider the graph here on the right, if the signal is currently at node A, we predict that sending the signal along the edge towards node B with an edge weight of 5 is preferred over sending it to node C with an edge weight of 2. Okay, so these were just 2 examples of what we have been working with. At the current stage of the project, we have now identified about 10 to 15 local measures. And what we have been doing, particularly over the past few weeks, is applying machine learning techniques to assign weights to each of our measures, which reflect the respective importance for neural communication. And here we have some preliminary results. So we have the list of measures here, each reflected in a different color, and an optimal weight assigned to each. So we have some measures that are strongly positively weighted, which means they appear to be very important for brain communication, while we have some weighted around 0, indicating that they're not very influential. And then we also have some, to our surprise, negatively weighted measures, which basically shows us that the opposite of our measure, the opposite of what we predicted, is favored by the brain. And what we can ultimately do with this data and these results is that we can create a communication algorithm in the form of a weighted combination of our local measures, which can predict neuronal communication pathways with high efficiency, and which essentially approximates the shortest path. But in contrast to shortest path algorithms, it will be biologically more realistic. And then further, we will also be able to extract some important information about the relationship between the brain structure and the brain's function. And here we just have a slightly different representation of the same results, with the weights being reflected here at the x-axis. Okay, thank you so much for listening. And also a big thank you to my supervisors and my research team, Carrie, Julian, Sergey, and Alex, as well as the Cognitive Neuroscience unit here at Deakin that we collaborate with.
Thank you, Lena. Just because of Lena's last couple of slides were about the machine learning, which Alex has always also been working on, and I'm sure later on we'll have a full presentation on that, but that machine learning component is being led by Frank Jian. Okay, so we also appreciate his contributions there as part of the team. Now I'm going to open the floor if anybody's got any questions for any of our presenters today. I'd like to acknowledge that all undergraduate students, and I think they've all done a fantastic job. Any questions?
Just curious how large the data sets were that you did the machine learning on for the brain.
Alex or Lena, would you like to answer? Lena.
Oh yeah, I think Alex can help me out with this, but I think we've been mainly working with 484 brains. Is that right, Alex?
Yeah, we have 484 different brains. So we split it up. Our test set was 292 different brains. And there are a couple about, I think there are about 40,000 different paths within each of those brains as well.
All right, thank you.
Hi, Alex, Lena, this is David here. Just got two quick questions. First is how many nodes were you working with in that brain graph?
Thanks, David. Yeah, we're working with 219 different nodes for that graph, for that data. So we had 3 different parcellations where we had one with 68, one with 114, and one with 219. So basically all the neurons in the brain we've condensed into 219. We're talking with some neuroscientists to define the different regions. And then we worked with the 219 version.
So your graph has 219 nodes, essentially. Okay. Another question is more on the communication. You've postulated different ways of communicating between different regions of the brain. Is there a way to verify your assertions through experiment from neuroscientists?
Yeah, we've been working with neuroscientists at the moment. At the moment, we haven't got an exact verification that that is what occurs in the brain. It goes that way. We've just got it's basically a method just saying that this is how much information could travel through between the different nodes that were highly functionally synchronous. And we've had some neuroscientists working with us on that.
Do they have any way to verify at least some of the assertions from your numerical results? For example, if you travel from, say, region A to region D, it takes 3 paths or 3 hops. Is there a way, I know it's not your problem, you guys are doing the computation, but is there a way, will they be able to verify? Because, or else a lot of these will be rather academic in a sense. If you're looking at it from an application perspective, I think it's important to know what's the end goal. Have they given you any clue as to whether is there any way to verify at least some of the path that you have determined through your whatever algorithm you used?
Yeah, I'm not too sure exactly of the how to verify it myself, but with talking with the others, there are some papers that have mentioned that the shorter paths are more efficient in the brain, where the hop length seems to be more of a influential factor on the efficiency than
is that based on biology or physiology or medical thing, or is this just some postulate that
yeah, so what we've basically been doing is either we've looked at what other neuroscientists have used previously, and otherwise what we've been doing a lot is as well look at the biological side of brain communication and have from that derived some measures as well. We cannot 100% say, okay, this is how it works, but like it is something that approximates what is going on in the brain.
Understandable. Yeah. I'm just, the reason why I brought this point is I know you guys are just doing the computation and maths of it, but it's sometimes important to understand the bigger picture of why we are doing this, whether it's leading to something that is of practical significance important. But thank you very much. I think your work is very important. It's very interesting. As they say, the last frontier in science is to understand how the brain works. So good work.
Thanks, David.
I think you have the long-term goal of the project is to try and identify those for rerouting in the brain. Emily, I was wondering, and maybe I missed it, but did you talk about how many edges you actually removed when you were finding the parts in your graph, your components in your graph?
So we were removing proportions. So each node was connected to every other, pretty much every other. And they, so we removed 80, 90, 95, I think it was. I can't remember the exact, but something like that. We experimented with different proportions.
So 95% of all the edges.
I'll just find it here.
Yeah.
So we dropped 80%, 90%, 95, and 99% of edges.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Bob. I see you have to leave now. That's unfortunate. Is there any further questions? Jacob, you're muted.
Sorry.
So did you have something you wanted to say?
You can't hear me? No.
I can hear you now.
Oh, great. I have a question for Lena, whether or not you took the impact of neurotransmitters on brain communication in your modeling, just chemical messages which can impede that communication or enhance.
Yeah, so we have considered this. The problem is that we're looking at the communication on a larger scale, so we can't really look at the chemical processes, but we have based on what is going on with neurotransmitters, we have looked at this and tried to create some measures that might approximate this process that is going on with neurotransmitters. But the problem is we can't really model what is going on at this small level. But yeah, so we're trying to, trying to create local measures that approximate these processes that are going on the microstructure level.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank all the presenters for presenting and everybody for attending today. Before we finish, I'm just going to flag that we are creating a mathematics yearbook this year, and we will tell you more about that in probably about a month's time. But many of the speakers today will be contributing to that yearbook, plus other undergraduate students in mathematics. So here is, it's a little bit big, here is a potential but not fixed yearbook cover. So more about that later. So just before we close, does anybody want to make any further comments? No. Well, thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.